She never imagined that a simple meeting would change the course of her life. At 50, she had always felt invisible to younger men, not because of her appearance, but because of the life she had lived, the weight of experience, loss, and the scars time had left. Antonia had always been respected for her intelligence, her successful career, but love seemed something that life no longer offered her. Youth no longer looked at her with admiration, and she accepted this with a melancholic serenity. She had grown accustomed to being the friend, the advisor, the figure who passed unnoticed when it came to romance. She was at a corporate event, a fancy dinner that felt more like an exhibition of egos and power. The men around her were older, experienced, with success stories that impressed. The atmosphere was heavy, suffocated by formality and alcohol, but she didn't mind. Her gaze wandered to the illuminated garden outside, where the guests rarely ventured. That's when she saw him. He was conversing with a group, but his eyes seemed distant, as though he was floating in the midst of that crowd. He had something that intrigued her, a quiet yet intense aura. Leandro, 28, son of a friend of the host, was there to discuss business, but his natural, laid-back manner made him seem like a stranger among the others. He wasn't concerned with impressing anyone, not hungry for status like the rest. His serene presence caught her attention in a way she couldn't ignore. She didn't know exactly what drew her to him. Perhaps it was the way he held himself, not seeking to prove anything but simply existing in the moment. Perhaps it was the sincerity he exuded in his gestures. He looked into her eyes without haste, without any sign of doubt about who she was. She felt a shiver, one she rarely experienced. She, who was always so firm, unshakable. When he approached, it wasn't with the hurried energy of the young, with that restless, eager-to-please attitude that usually made her pull away. Leandro approached her gently, politely, showing an interest in her life that was unique. Over the course of their conversation, they shared personal stories of pain and overcoming hardship, creating a deep emotional connection. She began to realize that he didn't see her just as an older woman, but as someone with inherent worth that transcended mere appearance. Yet what struck her most was when he left his group of conversations and smiled discreetly. He returned with a bottle of wine and asked if she'd like to join him in the garden. At first, she thought it might be a simple politeness, but he came back with such ease, and there was something about the way he invited her that felt genuine. Leandro seemed unconcerned with making small talk, with the usual societal pressures. Antonia found herself intrigued. She could tell that he wasn't judging her, that he wasn't placing her into a box of societal expectations, and that feeling of truly being seen touched her deeply. It had been so long since she felt someone really look at her, without any preconceptions. During their time together, he asked a simple question that stopped her in her tracks. "Have you ever asked yourself what you really want, Antonia?" She, who always had the answers, who was always the one others turned to for guidance, had never allowed herself the luxury of reflecting on that. It was a simple question, but it was sharp. The silence between them spoke volumes. It didn't need more words. His gaze challenged her to recognize herself, to allow herself to feel again. Antonia knew that this moment was not just any moment. Something was shifting inside her, but she didn't know exactly what. What touched her most was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long time. And, as much as her rational mind tried to deny it, her soul was responding to Leandro's silent invitation, the invitation to feel again. The evening went on with more conversations, more shy laughs and furtive glances, but what truly remained was the certainty that perhaps she was about to discover something about herself she didn't even know existed. Leandro's approach was not hurried or superficial. He wasn't trying to win her over with words or gestures. He simply wanted to get to know her. Antonia had met countless men in her life, but never had one made her feel so instantly comfortable, so seen. The connection between them was effortless, as if they had known each other for much longer than a few minutes. They moved from the crowded room to the quieter, intimate space of the garden. The sound of crickets, the faint rustling of leaves, and the distant hum of the party all seemed to fade away. It was as if they were alone in the world, and for the first time in a long time, Antonia didn't feel the weight of her age, her life's history, or the expectations of others. She felt present. Leandro's voice was calm and steady, and his words seemed to resonate with something deep inside her. They spoke of their childhoods, of losses, of dreams that had been delayed or abandoned. He listened to her as though every word she said mattered. Antonia, in turn, found herself sharing things she hadn't told anyone in years, things she had buried under layers of practicality and self-reliance. There was no judgment in his eyes, no sense of pity, just understanding. At some point, the conversation turned to their lives, and Leandro spoke about his own struggles. "You know, Antonia," he said, "I've always felt that we're often defined by other people's expectations, our parents, society, but I've started to wonder if that's really who we are." Antonia glanced at him, noticing the sincerity in his expression. She smiled softly. "It's funny," she said. "I spent my entire life trying to meet other people's expectations. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to ask myself what I wanted." Leandro nodded thoughtfully. "It's easy to lose sight of that, especially when you've spent your life making others proud. But when you look back, you realize that the person you've become might not be the person you would have chosen for yourself." Antonia felt a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to pretend. She could just be herself, vulnerable, real, and unafraid. They didn't need to say more. The silence between them was comfortable, natural, and filled with unspoken understanding. As they continued their walk, Antonia realized something profound. In Leandro's presence, she wasn't just seen, she was understood. That night, as they parted ways, Antonia felt something stir deep within her. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was the beginning of something new. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to allow herself to feel again. The following days unfolded quietly, yet nothing inside her remained the same. Antonia moved through her routine with a subtle, unfamiliar softness, as though something in her had awakened from a long winter. She replayed moments from the garden in her mind, the way Leandro listened without hesitation, the gentleness in his gaze, the unspoken understanding that seemed to rise naturally between them. It all felt too vivid to dismiss, yet too fragile to trust. She carried those impressions discreetly, almost protectively, not wanting anyone else to touch what she still did not fully comprehend. The next corporate gathering arrived sooner than she expected, a luncheon organized by old colleagues and acquaintances who loved the sound of their own evaluations. These events always carried a predictable choreography: polite greetings, carefully measured compliments, and judgment disguised as concern. Antonia had mastered the art of appearing immune to it all, but that day, something in her posture betrayed a new lightness, a quiet shift that others noticed before she did. When Leandro entered the room, heads turned, not because he demanded attention, but because he possessed a presence that softened the atmosphere without trying. He greeted people with ease, but his eyes found Antonia with an instinctive precision that startled even him. There was no hesitation, no calculation. He simply moved toward her. That single gesture was enough to trigger murmurs around the table. Some observed with thinly veiled curiosity. Others exchanged glances filled with assumptions. For those who fed on appearances, he was far too young, far too poised, far too unexpected to be approaching her with that calm certainty. Antonia felt the weight of those glances press against her skin like cold wind, reminding her of the invisible rules she had obeyed for years. Leandro's presence beside her felt both comforting and dangerous. He didn't touch her, didn't lean too closely, yet his proximity alone created an unspoken line between her and the rest of the room, as if he had chosen her without asking permission from a world that expected him to choose differently. Antonia felt exposed, not because of anything he did, but because the room suddenly seemed to see her for the first time, and not in the way she wished. A colleague approached, smiling politely while his eyes betrayed a quiet condescension. He asked about her work, her recent projects, and then shifted the conversation subtly toward Leandro, as if trying to understand what could possibly connect them. The undertone was unmistakable, curiosity mixed with disbelief, wrapped in social courtesy. Antonia felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the old instinct to shrink, to protect herself before someone else decided she did not belong in a moment she hadn't even claimed for herself. Leandro noticed the shift in her expression. His posture changed slightly, not defensive but quietly firm. Without interrupting the conversation, he allowed his presence to settle beside her with a steadiness that subtly redirected the energy around them. He didn't try to explain anything to anyone. He didn't offer justifications or reassurances. He simply stood there as though her place beside him was unquestionable. The murmurs around them softened into silence, but the tension lingered like a thin veil. Antonia felt the familiar discomfort of being evaluated, as though people were silently calculating the distance between her age and his, between their worlds, between what was expected and what was unfolding without permission. Later, when she stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, the afternoon light settling gently on the terrace, she allowed the truth to surface within her. She had forgotten what it felt like to be the subject of speculation, to be at the center of a story others believed they had the right to interpret. But there was something deeper beneath that discomfort, something that unsettled her even more. She realized that part of her feared they were right. That fear had lived inside her far longer than she cared to admit. As she stood in the quiet of the terrace, Leandro joined her without asking if she wanted company. His presence wasn't intrusive. It was grounding. The soft breeze brushed against them, carrying away the remnants of whispers from inside. Antonia looked at the horizon, trying to steady herself, while he simply existed beside her, offering nothing but calm. She did not need saving. She did not need declarations. She only needed space, and he understood that instinctively. When she finally turned to face him, she saw no confusion, no insecurity, no concern about what others thought, only clarity, only quiet conviction. It was this steadiness, more than his youth, more than his gentleness, that unsettled her heart in ways she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Antonia felt a subtle shift inside her, like a door unlocking somewhere in the depths. The world around her might judge, speculate, and whisper, but Leandro's presence had revealed a truth she could no longer avoid. The fear she carried wasn't about society. It was about allowing herself to be seen again. And for the first time, she wondered if she was ready to be seen not through the lens of age or expectation, but through the lens of possibility. The event that shattered her fragile sense of safety arrived without warning, unfolding with the cruel elegance that only public judgment possesses. It happened during a family gathering organized by relatives who enjoyed curating appearances more than cultivating sincerity. Antonia had been invited out of courtesy, one of those obligatory gestures meant to maintain harmony among relatives who barely knew how she lived or what she felt. The house was bright, adorned for celebration, filled with the noise of conversations that floated like static. Antonia took a seat near a corner, hoping to remain unnoticed, blending quietly into the background. She had done this for years, existing without taking up space. But with the memory of Leandro's presence still warm inside her, she could no longer dissolve into the room as easily as before. Something in her posture had changed, a softness that others sensed even before she spoke. Her niece, known for her sharp observations and sharper tongue, noticed almost immediately. The younger woman approached with an air of curiosity, disguised as affection, as though eager to uncover something she had no right to. She leaned in, commenting on Antonia's appearance, her expression, the way she seemed different. The remark wasn't cruel on the surface, but the undertone carried a sting, an invitation for others to look, to speculate, to whisper. Word traveled quickly among the relatives, a silent current moving through the room. Some observed her with mild confusion, others with amusement, but a few watched with something colder, judgment sharpened by expectations they held about women her age. They spoke in subtle phrases, carefully crafted to appear harmless, yet each word pressed against her skin like a small blade. Then Leandro arrived. He entered the gathering with the same calm presence he carried everywhere. He greeted people politely, unaware of the storm brewing in the room. But the moment he approached Antonia, naturally, instinctively, as though drawn by something stronger than courtesy, the entire atmosphere shifted. The room fell into a hush so quiet it almost rang. A few relatives exchanged glances. Some widened their eyes, others whispered behind the rims of their glasses. The sight of a 28-year-old man moving toward a 50-year-old woman with familiarity was enough to ignite the embers of judgment. Antonia felt the air thicken. She could sense every pair of eyes on her, evaluating, questioning, dissecting. Her niece whispered something to a cousin, who stifled a laugh behind her hand. Someone murmured that perhaps Antonia had lost perspective. Another suggested she was seeking attention. The comments grew bolder with each whisper, feeding on one another. But the moment that cut deepest came from an unexpected place. A distant relative who had always prided herself on traditional expectations. She raised her voice just enough for the nearby group to hear, and said something that pierced through the air like a shard of glass. An insinuation that Antonia was confusing admiration with delusion, that she was clinging to youth that did not belong to her. The words struck with such force that Antonia felt heat rise beneath her skin, followed by a hollow cold spreading through her chest. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat tightened, her breath faltered, and suddenly she felt herself shrinking into that old, familiar invisibility she had fought so hard to escape. Leandro witnessed the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her gaze dropped ever so slightly, the way she withdrew into herself. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't raise his voice or defend her with dramatic gestures. Instead, he stepped closer, not touching her, not claiming her, but aligning himself beside her with quiet certainty. His presence alone contradicted every cruel whisper in the room. While the others stared, waiting for further spectacle, Leandro's calm expression softened. His eyes held a steady truth that radiated warmth toward her, creating a quiet refuge amid the storm. The contrast between his serenity and the crowd's judgment was stark, unmistakable, almost disarming. The murmurs faded, not because the relatives approved, but because his composure made their cruelty look small, insignificant even. The room, once filled with noise, now felt distant, muted, as though Antonia and Leandro stood on a separate plane where only honesty remained. In that moment, she realized something painful, yet liberating. The humiliation she felt did not come from the event itself, but from years of absorbing society's expectations as though they were truths. The public judgment only scraped the surface of a wound that had been there far longer than this gathering. As the evening continued, she excused herself, stepping outside into the cool air. The night embraced her gently, washing away the noise. She inhaled deeply, feeling the ache beneath her ribs, an ache that carried both hurt and awakening. She was tired of shrinking, tired of apologizing for existing, tired of believing that her worth could be dictated by whispers. And as she stood under the quiet sky, she understood that this pain was not a step backward. It was the breaking point before something new could finally begin. She woke the next morning with a heaviness she couldn't name. The humiliation of the previous night still lingered beneath her skin, settling into places she had tried for years to keep protected. Antonia moved through her home with quiet precision, doing what she always did when overwhelmed. She returned to routine, to structure, to the illusion of control. Yet nothing inside her felt steady. Something fragile had cracked. The connection with Leandro, once warm and grounding, now frightened her. The more she felt, the more exposed she became to the judgments she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Every look from the night before replayed itself in her mind. The lifted eyebrows, the whispered remarks, the laughter thinly masked behind polite smiles. Shame tugged at her like an old, familiar weight. She told herself she needed distance. Distance from him, from the feelings he stirred, from the risks she wasn't sure she could take. She convinced herself that stepping back was a form of wisdom, a way to protect them both from the harshness of the world. Antonia rehearsed reasons in her mind. He was too young. She was too guarded. Their worlds too different. She chose these excuses carefully, stacking them like bricks around her heart, hoping they would form a wall strong enough to silence the part of her that wanted to stay close to him. But Leandro sensed the shift immediately. When they met again at a work function a few days later, Antonia kept her tone polite, her movements measured, her smile distant. She didn't linger when he approached, didn't allow her eyes to rest on him the way they once had. She spoke as though they were acquaintances, not two people who had shared moments quiet and meaningful enough to echo long after they ended. The distance she created wasn't cruel. It was controlled, practiced, almost serene, but it was unmistakably there. Leandro observed her with thoughtful restraint. His eyes held neither frustration nor hurt, only a deep understanding tinged with quiet sadness. He didn't push. He didn't ask for explanations. Instead, he regarded her with the same calm presence that had drawn her to him in the first place. He saw the fear beneath her composure, the tension behind her smile, the caution woven into every gesture. And he recognized something else, her instinct to run before she could be pushed away. The weight of her withdrawal pressed on her throughout the day, but she clung to it as a necessary step. She tried to convince herself that this detachment was responsible, mature, sensible. But each time she saw the steadiness in his expression, a part of her wavered. His silence was not distance. It was respect. The way he stepped back wasn't rejection. It was an offering of space, as though he knew she needed room to breathe, to make choices without pressure. When she returned home that evening, she sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the quiet that once comforted her. But now the silence felt different, hollow, almost suffocating. She realized that in trying to protect herself from judgment, she had begun repeating the same pattern that had kept her heart untouched for years. She had mistaken fear for caution, solitude for safety. The truth settled slowly inside her. Distancing herself from him did not make her stronger. It made her smaller. But admitting that felt too risky. So she wrapped herself in the familiar armor of restraint, unaware that the walls she rebuilt were already beginning to crack under the weight of feelings she could no longer deny. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet question formed, a question she wasn't ready to face. Was she stepping back to protect her heart? Or was she stepping back because she didn't believe she deserved to be seen the way he saw her? Life has a way of revealing truths at unexpected moments. For Antonia, it happened on a rainy afternoon, when the sky hung low and heavy, and the city seemed wrapped in a muted hush. She had left work later than usual, her mind tangled with unresolved thoughts, her heart still uncertain about the distance she had forced between herself and Leandro. The streets were slick with rain, the air thick with the scent of wet pavement, and she hurried through the crosswalk without noticing how quickly the traffic light had changed. A sudden blare of a horn jolted her. A car, skidding on the wet road, swerved dangerously close. In the split second before she reacted, a firm grip closed around her arm and pulled her back with decisive strength. The world seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. The rain suspended in the air, her breath caught in her throat, her pulse echoing loudly in her ears. When she turned, breathless and shaken, she found Leandro standing beside her, his expression filled with a mixture of fear and relief that made her chest tighten. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't calculated. He had simply acted. His presence felt like a shelter in the storm, grounding her in a way that pierced through every wall she had tried to rebuild. There was no drama in his posture, no attempt to turn the moment into something grand, only a quiet, unwavering concern that spoke louder than any declaration. He didn't ask if she was all right. His eyes already held the answer. He didn't scold her for her distraction. He didn't use the moment to bridge the distance she had created. Instead, he stepped back slightly, giving her space to breathe, as though he understood that the depths of the moment might overwhelm her. The restraint in his gesture was its own kind of tenderness, a sign that he cared enough not to claim a moment she wasn't ready to share. Antonia's hands trembled slightly as she steadied herself. She felt the magnitude of what had just happened, how close she had come to danger, how instinctively he had intervened, how deeply his presence affected her. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered, the mix of fear and gratitude swelling into something she couldn't name. Leandro simply waited. His silence wasn't passive. It was attentive, patient, steady. And in that quiet, Antonia saw something she had refused to acknowledge. His feelings were not a whim, not a youthful fascination. not a fleeting attraction. They were real. They were rooted. They were consistent. While she had pulled away in fear, he had remained present, not invading, not insisting, but remaining. The realization softened something inside her. She saw in him a kind of loyalty she hadn't experienced in years, the kind that wasn't loud or dramatic but revealed itself in actions, in presence, in instinct. He had shown her that his care was not conditional, not dependent on her reciprocation. It existed because it was genuine. As the rain eased into a gentle drizzle, Antonia felt a shift inside her, subtle, yet undeniable. She understood now that her fear did not protect her from pain. It only protected her from possibility. And Leandro, without words, without demands, had reminded her of something she once believed in, but had long forgotten. That love is proven not in declarations, but in presence. That day became a quiet turning point, the moment when the walls around her heart began to crumble, not from pressure, but from truth. The days that followed carried an unusual stillness, as though time itself had slowed to give her space to understand what she was feeling. Antonia moved through her routine with more care than intention, sensing that something deep within her was shifting, though she could not yet give it a name. The moment in the rain replayed in her mind with a clarity that unsettled her. The way Leandro had acted, without hesitation, without calculation, left an imprint she couldn't ignore. And yet, instead of offering her certainty, it awakened contradictions she had kept buried for years. She found herself caught between longing and self-protection. One part of her reached instinctively for the steadiness he offered, craving the warmth she felt in his presence. Another part urged her to retreat, whispering warnings shaped by years of caution, disappointment, and the quiet belief that love, even when real, was not meant for her. She had spent so long building a life based on control and independence that letting anyone close felt like unraveling a carefully woven fabric. At work, she caught herself drifting into thought more often than usual. The smallest things triggered her. An expression on someone's face, the sound of rain against the windows, a passing memory of the way Leandro's eyes softened when he looked at her. She wondered whether she was imagining the connection, exaggerating its depth to fill the quiet spaces in her life. Doubt crept in, not because he had given her any reason to question him, but because trusting someone felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. One evening, she walked to a nearby cafe to clear her mind. The place was nearly empty, filled with the gentle murmur of soft music and the scent of brewed coffee. She took a seat near the window and allowed herself to feel the weight of her own thoughts. She felt torn, conflicted, pulled in opposite directions by fear and possibility. Her reflection in the window looked different somehow. Not older or younger, but unsettled, as though she were standing at the edge of a choice she wasn't prepared to make. As she stirred her coffee absently, she questioned whether her hesitation was rooted in logic or in old wounds that refused to heal. Her past relationships had been marked by disappointment, by slow erosion rather than abrupt endings. She had learned to protect herself, to expect little, to survive quietly. The idea of being truly seen, of being wanted not for convenience or obligation, but for who she was, felt both intoxicating and terrifying. Leandro's presence had disrupted this equilibrium. He had arrived not with promises or declarations, but with consistency, with steadiness, with a sincerity she wasn't accustomed to. He didn't chase her, but he didn't disappear. He let her step back, but he didn't step away. His patience felt like a language she was only beginning to understand. She realized that the true conflict wasn't about the difference in their ages or the judgment of others. It was about the part of her that still believed she didn't deserve the tenderness he offered. She feared misreading him, feared building hopes that might crumble, feared the possibility of being seen and then dismissed. Vulnerability felt like exposure, and exposure felt like risk. But beneath all of that, deeper than her fears, was a quiet yearning she could no longer deny. She wanted to feel alive again. She wanted to feel chosen. She wanted to step into something that felt real, even if it came wrapped in uncertainty. And the truth she finally admitted to herself was that she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of herself, of returning to a version of her she had buried long ago. That night, as she walked home beneath the dim glow of streetlights, the cool breeze brushed against her skin like a gentle reminder. She had been holding herself back for so long that she had forgotten how to move toward something that mattered. The conflict inside her wasn't a barrier. It was the beginning of change. And though she still didn't know what choice she would make, she understood that the answer would not come from fear, but from courage she had yet to claim. The turning point did not arrive with grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It came quietly, in the form of an invitation, one that felt simple on the surface, but carried a depth that caught her off guard. Leandro reached out to her one afternoon, asking if she would meet him at a small art gallery tucked away on a quiet street. It was a place she had mentioned once in passing, not expecting him to remember. Yet he had remembered, and he had chosen it with intention. When she arrived, the space was bathed in soft, golden light. The air was calm, filled with the subtle warmth of silence and scattered footsteps from a few visitors moving slowly between the pieces on display. There was something intimate about the setting, unrushed, thoughtful, quietly alive. She found Leandro standing near a painting, his posture relaxed, as though he had been waiting not with impatience, but with quiet certainty. As she approached, he turned to her with a gaze that held no expectation, only presence. It was then she realized that this moment wasn't about resolving anything. It was about understanding, about seeing each other without the noise of judgment or fear. They walked through the gallery together, moving from one piece to the next. The art around them seemed to echo their unspoken feelings, fragments of color, texture, and emotion woven into forms that required contemplation. With each step, the space between them softened. She found herself breathing easier, feeling the heaviness inside her ease with every quiet moment shared. At one point, they stopped before a painting of two figures standing on opposite sides of a vast landscape, their silhouettes reaching toward one another but separated by distance and uncertainty. The image stirred something deep inside her. She felt an ache she could not name, a longing mixed with recognition. Leandro spoke softly, not looking at her, but at the painting. He told her about a moment from his past, something he had never shared with her, a disappointment that had shaped him, a loneliness he had carried quietly, a fear of giving too much of himself only to be misunderstood. As he spoke, his voice remained steady, but there was a vulnerability beneath it that revealed more than his words. He wasn't trying to impress her or to justify himself. He was letting her see him, fully, honestly, without reservation. Antonia felt her breath catch. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed that youth made people invulnerable, that time had not yet carved into him the depth she carried. But standing there, listening to him speak with such quiet sincerity, she saw that he was not untouched by life. His wounds might have been different, but they were no less real. And in that moment, she understood something essential. He wasn't drawn to her in spite of her age. He was drawn to her because her depth matched his own. As the gallery lights dimmed slightly in preparation for closing, their silhouettes shifted in the reflective glass of a nearby window. For the first time, she saw them not as others might see, a contrast of ages, a mismatch of expectations, but as two people standing at the edge of possibility. Two lives that, despite their differences, moved in quiet harmony. She felt a tightening in her chest, not of fear, but of truth. The distance she had tried to maintain now felt unnecessary, even painful. She realized that the judgment of others had mattered only because she had not yet decided what she believed about herself. But in his presence, those doubts began to lose their grip. Leandro finally turned to her, his expression open, steady, unguarded. And in the silence between them, something unspoken unfolded, a recognition that neither of them could deny. He did not need to confess anything. She already knew. In that quiet golden moment, the landscape between them changed, not with a leap, but with a gentle shift that felt inevitable. The days that followed the moment at the gallery unfolded with a quiet clarity, as though the world had gently shifted into alignment without making a sound. Antonia carried within her a newfound stillness, soft, fragile, yet undeniable. It wasn't certainty, and it wasn't confidence. It was awareness. awareness of her own heart, of the connection that had grown between her and Leandro, of the truth she had avoided for far too long. She felt herself breathing differently, as if each inhale allowed a little more courage to seep into the places where fear once lived. When an invitation arrived from an old colleague, a large charity dinner filled with influential names and familiar faces, she almost declined. These gatherings were arenas disguised as celebrations, spaces where appearances mattered more than sincerity. But something inside her urged her to go, not to prove anything, not to display anything, but to step into the world, no longer hiding from herself. The night of the event, she dressed with a care she had not felt in years, not to impress, but to honor herself. Her reflection in the mirror startled her, not because she looked younger, but because she looked present. The quiet glow in her eyes was subtle, but unmistakable. She no longer felt like someone trying to blend into the background. She felt like someone stepping into the light with intention. When she entered the venue, the atmosphere hummed with murmurs and soft laughter, the glittering decorations catching the dim light like fragments of stardust. Antonia moved through the crowd with her usual grace, but beneath her composed exterior was a pulse of anticipation she didn't fully understand. Then she saw him. Leandro arrived moments later, not seeking attention, yet drawing it effortlessly. His presence was calm, steady, almost grounding. When his eyes found hers across the room, something warm unfolded between them. Quiet, unmistakable recognition. He approached without hesitation, not swift or bold, but with a firm assurance that softened her breath. The room noticed. Whispers began almost immediately, weaving through the crowd like threads of speculation. Some eyes widened with curiosity, others narrowed with judgment, while a few lit up with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. She felt the weight of their stares settle on her shoulders. But this time, something was different. The judgment no longer consumed her. It no longer defined her. It simply floated around her, unable to penetrate the truth she now held within. Leandro reached her side with a presence that seemed to shift the energy around them. He greeted her quietly, his expression holding a warmth that steadied her from the inside out. He did not touch her. He did not claim her. But the space between them felt anchored. Two lives standing in quiet alignment, unaffected by the murmurs swirling in the air. A former co-worker approached, her smile tight with curiosity. She made a comment about Antonia's radiant change, then glanced meaningfully at Leandro. Others drifted closer, pretending to engage in conversation while their eyes darted between the two of them. A man she had known for years asked if they had come together, his tone dripping with subtle condescension. Antonia felt a familiar tremor of doubt rise, but before it could take root, she caught the calm in Leandro's posture. His presence beside her wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was unwavering. He spoke to her colleague with quiet confidence, not defensive, not apologetic, simply truthful. His tone held no explanation, no justification, only authenticity. The questions softened, the smirks faded, the assumptions lost their footing. The room, once so eager to dissect her, now found itself confronted with a truth that could not be ridiculed. The connection between them was real, and for the first time, Antonia didn't shrink. She didn't lower her gaze. She stood tall, not out of defiance but out of acceptance. Acceptance of herself, of her desires, of the unexpected tenderness that had found her. She realized then that the judgment of others only held power over her because she had not yet claimed her own truth. When the crowd eventually dispersed and the noise softened, she and Leandro stepped outside onto the terrace. The night air was cool, gentle, brushing against her skin like a quiet affirmation. City lights shimmered in the distance, reflecting against the darkness like small promises. Leandro stood beside her, not closer, not farther, simply beside her, as though he understood the significance of the moment before she even spoke. She felt a stillness settle deep within, a recognition not of him, but of herself. She turned to him, and in the soft glow of the terrace lights, she saw the truth reflected in his expression. Not youth, not fascination, but a quiet, deep admiration rooted in sincerity. And in that moment, she understood what had changed. She no longer feared being seen. She feared only the years she had wasted believing she wasn't allowed to be. The morning after the event, Antonia awoke with a sense of clarity that felt almost foreign. It wasn't the exhilaration of something new, nor the anxiety of something uncertain. It was peace, a gentle, steady peace that settled in her chest like a truth finally accepted. For the first time in years, she felt aligned with herself, not with expectations, not with caution, but with the quiet whisper of her own heart. She spent the day moving slowly, allowing the memory of the night to replay without fear. The steadiness in Leandro's gaze, the absence of hesitation, the way he remained beside her through every whisper and sideways glance, it revealed a kind of loyalty she had long stopped believing in. And the woman she saw reflected in his presence was not invisible, not aging, not diminished. She was luminous, worthy, and capable of beginning again. That afternoon, Leandro asked if he could see her. There was no urgency in his message, only openness. She agreed, feeling a warmth settle inside her at the thought of another moment shared without pretense. They met in a quiet park shaded by tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze. The world around them moved slowly, children playing in the distance, leaves rustling softly, sunlight filtering through branches like scattered hope. Antonia arrived first, settling onto a bench with a calm she had never felt before. When he approached, his steps were unhurried, his expression steady. He sat beside her without speaking, allowing the silence to stretch comfortably between them. It felt natural, almost grounding. For a long while, they simply breathed in the quiet, letting the moment settle around them like a soft blanket. She looked at him then, really looked, seeing not the contrast of age but the sincerity of presence. He wasn't a symbol, wasn't a fantasy, wasn't a rebellion against judgment. He was simply a man who saw her, who had seen her from the very beginning, and whose heart aligned with hers in ways neither of them had expected. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but certain. She told him about her fears, of judgment, of vulnerability, of believing she wasn't allowed to be happy in ways that defied expectation. She shared the weight of her past, the loneliness she had accepted as inevitable, the ways she had built walls to keep herself safe from disappointment. She expected the words to tremble, but they didn't. They flowed with the honesty she had long kept hidden. Leandro listened, not with intensity, but with presence. His stillness was its own kind of tenderness, a quiet reassurance that nothing she said could change the truth he held within him. When she finished, he didn't respond with declarations or promises. Instead, he offered something far more powerful, his understanding, a warmth in his gaze, a softness in his expression, a steadiness in the way he breathed beside her. The wounds she carried did not disappear in that moment, but something inside her shifted. The fear that had once controlled her steps loosened its hold. She felt lighter, as though she had set something down she had carried for too long. As the afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground, she made a quiet decision. Not for him, but for herself. She chose to step into the life she wanted. Not the one others found acceptable, but the one that made her feel whole. She chose tenderness over fear, possibility over silence, courage over judgment. When she stood, he rose with her, their movements instinctively aligned. They walked through the park side by side, the distance between them now filled with truth rather than hesitation. She felt the beginning of something, not a fairy tale, not a perfect story, but a real one. One shaped by two people willing to see one another fully, without filter or fear. Her healing did not come from him. It came from the way she allowed herself to open in his presence. And the re-beginning they stepped into was not defined by age or expectation, but by something far more enduring: recognition, respect, and the quiet, unwavering choice to walk forward together. As they reached the exit of the park, the sky washed in the soft glow of the setting sun, Antonia felt a calm she had never known. It was the feeling of being seen, and finally believing she deserved to be.